Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I do want to make sure we get started on time to promptly dive right into today's content. For this session, we're going to be doing a fireside chat between Colin, Herold, and I regarding insights from real implementation projects and perspectives that can be shared regarding just what goes right and what goes wrong. So, for those of you I have never met before, my name is Tony Nelson. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing here at PlanetTogether. I have a background coming from the Salesforce.com world where I did a lot of time in data integration, master data management, big data projects across CRM and ERPs. But today, we're really going to be talking about a topic that comes pretty much for every conversation that I get into with new companies I'm interacting with, they all kind of have the same question. So we wanted to make a webinar about this, which is what makes an APS project successful? So this is not necessarily a pitch about PlanetTogether. This is just to talk about strategy. When you're going to do an APS rollout, what are some things to consider? So when we say what is a successful project, I don't just mean from a technical perspective, but this could be from a business perspective. What are your deliverables? How do you drive adoption? What's kind of the operational impact that you can or should be planning for? So over the last couple of webinars that we've done, we've spent a lot of time discussing the limitations of Excel, and how Excel scheduling and why manufacturers should be looking to move beyond spreadsheets and kind of the crippling effect of staying there. So when we're talking about this today, we're really going to be covering questions that, strategically are going to fall under buckets like what separates projects that have gone well and not well, or, what should you be on the lookout for? So to help answer those kinds of questions, we've brought in today Colin Herold, who's the Director of Professional Services here at PlanetTogether. And he's been in the professional services space for over 12 years, leading and growing and developing professional services teams. Colin works directly with our customers throughout all of our APS implementations and has seen firsthand what makes projects successful and some of the trends that those things have in common. So, Colin, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? Let's just dive right in. I want to make sure we get you spotlighted here so we can chat and talk through this. But here's what we'll do. We'll add us there. So let's just go ahead and dive right into some hard questions, right from the beginning. So when we're talking APS projects, right? You've seen a bunch of these.
Hmm.
When a company is beginning an advanced planning and scheduling project, what is the biggest mistake that they tend to make when they're thinking about either ROI or project goals, just in general?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest mistakes is treating an APS implementation as primarily a technology upgrade instead of a business transformation initiative. A lot of organizations initially focus on tactical improvements like reducing scheduler workload, eliminating spreadsheets, or automating manual processes. And don't get me wrong, those are absolutely valuable outcomes. But I believe that the larger ROI typically comes from operational performance improvements. Uh, things like increasing effective capacity or
Yeah.
improving throughput. Um, and the most successful APS implementations start by defining the business outcomes first, and then designing the implementation around those priorities.
All right, fair enough. So let me go back to one of the things that you just mentioned. You were talking about how companies need to define some of the metrics or the objectives. How would you maybe separate this out between good operational metrics at the tactical level to consider versus being able to demonstrate some of the strategic business value that executives might care about, because those are more than likely very different at times.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say that there is often a relationship between the two. When I think about operational metrics, these are usually activity focused. So
Okay.
scheduler efficiency, planning cycle time,
Yeah.
utilization of the system, right? um, schedule generation speed, where when I'm thinking about the strategic metrics, um, these can and should directly link to either, financial impact or customer impact. So revenue enablement, again, effective capacity gains, inventory reduction, margin protection,
Some of the
and
bigger stuff. Got it.
yeah,
Yeah.
man.
Well, let me maybe take this a slightly different direction then. If you've got, let's say, some of those, the tactical things you just mentioned, as well as some of the bigger picture things like inventory reduction or any of the others that you've mentioned,
Hmm.
how important have you seen it in projects to get a firm baseline so you even understand how much of a gain a project like this would have on a company after they've done a deployment?
Yeah, in a word, I think it's critical, right? If organizations don't establish that baseline before the implementation, it becomes difficult to quantify the success and the ROI that you're getting out of that process. It can lead ultimately to creating some problems such as, leadership struggling to validate the ROI, and also the team and the users losing alignment around what does success actually look like, right? Um, I think baselining creates objectivity, and it allows companies to clearly demonstrate, service improvements, throughput gains, schedule stability, or responsiveness to improvements after go live.
Yeah. Now you mentioned as like one of the drawbacks of not putting a baseline in place that like leaders will struggle to affirm that the project has been, worth doing. Are there any other kind of, I don't know, major drawbacks from like a leadership perspective around validation of the project that you've seen if they don't have some kind of baseline? How do they know if the project has been successful a year, 2 years from now? You know, they put the
Well,
reputations on the line putting this in place. So how do they validate that, without this?
yeah, well, I recognize that in certain cases there can be some challenges to establishing baselines from what came before, particularly if it was grounded in, the brilliant minds of the team, tribal knowledge, right? That can be hard to quantify or capture in some cases. Um,
Sure.
I think the best strategy, if that is a hurdle, is not looking at that as a missed opportunity, but
Okay.
shifting the opportunity into the implementation, still taking that opportunity to baseline, whether it's during, initially during, say, UAT, how long does it take us to produce the schedule now? Go live, how about now? During hypercare, how are we doing? Right? So capturing that moment, because I do think that that comparison of where we were and where we are now is really important as a part of the value story.
Yeah. So better late than never, even if it's not at the beginning. Get it done. So I think that's
Correct.
important.
Correct.
Fair enough. Well, let's maybe think about, not just a single site. We work with a lot of companies. We've seen a lot of organizations that have got locations across the globe where they're doing manufacturing or maybe, 5 to 10 sites in a particular region. So I want to kind of think about overall strategy when it comes to multi-site operations. So when
Hmm.
you've seen companies operating multiple facilities, whether it's in the same geographic region or spread out globally, what's usually the biggest challenge that those companies discover when they're getting into a project?
Hmm.
Great.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the biggest discoveries is that facilities that appear similarly operationally or in terms of what goods they produce are often scheduling very differently kind
Yeah,
of underneath the surface, right?
yeah,
Whether that is hey, we have different processes, not necessarily because of nuance, but just we've done things differently. They're using different constraints. They sequence work differently. They have different resources involved in producing the same finished good, right? You know, even if the end result is the same, if you have, say, three factories and two of them produce a finished good across five different operations that each run on five different machines or resources, and you have a third factory that has an advanced machine that can handle all five of those operations on a single machine, that's a fundamental difference from a scheduling perspective. And so it's important to dig into that, right?
Okay. Well, let me peel back a layer on that real quick. So let's say that a company does have three sites, like you just mentioned,
Mm,
and let's think data for a second, because APSs are only ever as good as the data that you feed into them. So
mm.
when you think about advanced planning and scheduling, should companies aim to standardize the scheduling process or their data layer across all of the plants, or should they allow each site to operate uniquely? What creates the best success for companies?
Well, I think certainly it's something that should be looked at ahead of an implementation rollout. I think the answer to that lies in a balance between enterprise consistency where possible and tailoring to site-specific nuance when there are true site deltas, right?
Okay.
I think the barometer for whether or not you should unify, whether it's data or process, right, is are these sites fundamentally different in actuality, or is it
Hmm.
because we've just done things differently historically, right? And
Interesting. So when you say fundamentally different, what would constitute something that's a fundamental difference versus just maybe two plants have got, schedulers that have just done things the way they've done it for the last 10 years and they never talk to each other. How do you know the differences between those situations?
yeah, I would think about the some of the physical differences of the site, right? Is the shop floor layout substantially different where it actually impacts the process itself?
Okay.
The resource example again, are we using a different set of resources to arrive at the same place? Those sorts of things need to be accounted for, right? And should lead to differentiation. But
Yeah, yeah, fair point, fair point. Well, thinking about kind of multiple facilities again, and maybe we even just kind of drill this down a little bit in case people are on the call today and they've only got one site. If we're going to take maybe a phased approach to rolling out advanced planning and scheduling versus just a large deployment all at once, if it's a single site, maybe that's just deploying to one line, or if it's multiple sites, maybe it's one facility versus 10. When companies are transitioning out of Excel, what are some of the factors that determine whether a phased rollout or a full deployment across everything makes the most sense?
yeah, it's a good one. Where my mind goes on that, change readiness, existing system
Yeah,
complexity, uh, and and potentially an appetite for living in multiple environments, particularly if we're talking within one site, right? Um, I think at the end of the day, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, across all clients, across all situations.
sure.
It we've seen companies be highly successful with both approaches. It's really about the balance of, appetite and preparation for that change event. Again, not just from a data perspective or an implementation perspective, but from a transformation perspective and change management. Um, I think balancing that against that notion of what's that timeline where we are 1 foot in the past and 1 foot in the new.
Okay, walk me through that a little bit because this is oftentimes something I don't hear people factoring in is what it looks like to live in the old and the new for a little while during that transition. So what's the biggest risk associated with kind of riding the fence like that whenever you're doing a phased rollout that people need to consider?
Yeah, well, I think this is particularly true when we're talking about, within the context of a site, right?
Mhm.
It can lead to um, well, some operational risks by having, a confluence of two different systems for ultimately trying to achieve the same result, right? You're handling part of your scheduling activities over here, another set here.
Yeah,
In my experience, that can lead to some process dilution, right? And I think you need a
right.
strong plan for driving adoption, right? I think you have to design that plan uh, with a lot of nuance and care in terms of how are we going to manage that, right? How are we going to design with the end in mind and make sure that we're hitting those milestones and continuing to progress? Because
Yeah.
ultimately the full value unlock is when they make that complete transition. So having a plan for that is key.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a fair point. You talked about the real benefits unlock when you make that transition. So what's the advice you might give to a company that is deciding to go through phased rollout or something like that, whether it's one line or one site, and they're going to create this pilot project? How do they avoid getting stuck in like a pilot purgatory? Where it's just like the APS never gets beyond that initial testing phase. They never make it to that full deployment like you just mentioned. How do you help people not get stuck there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, pilot purgatory, in my experience, it usually happens when an organization treats the pilot as a technology experiment, right? Instead of the first phase of a broader transformation roadmap.
Yeah.
I think when I think about a successful pilot, we're going into this with defined success criteria, executive sponsorship, and champions sort of identified at a more tactical level as well, right? Uh, we have an expansion timeline and a clear scaling strategy from day one. The pilot should validate the template. It should prove scalability, uh, not become the destination, and I think that's the key.
Got it. Got it. Well, I know we're coming up on time for Q&A, so if anybody has got questions that you'd like to ask Colin, feel free to start putting them in the chat. But before we hop into a time of Q&A, Colin, maybe just, you know, any parting words of wisdom or advice you might give, just in general, if you had to sit across the table from anybody in the audience, grab a cup of coffee, and just provide some perspective on if you want to set yourself up for success in a very strong APS deployment, what's maybe the first thing that you'd recommend they begin looking at or evaluating to really get their ducks in a row?
Yeah, well, I know earlier I mentioned that treating APS as an operational transformation initiative, not just a software implementation, is key. So I'll quickly give you one more. Uh,
Of course.
Equally important in my mind is involving the operational teams early. I think the best scheduling systems are not the ones that look necessarily the most sophisticated technically. They're the ones that the planners, the schedulers, the operational leaders trust and adopt in daily decision making.
Yeah, got it. Got it. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. I want to walk through one thing before we open up to Q&A. So for those of you who have never seen this resource before, this is actually an APS readiness ebook that Colin and I worked together to produce. It's about a 20-page document that really assesses what has made projects go well, what's knocked them off track, and what you can do to assess where you're at right now before you ever engage with the project. So this is not, again, not about PlanetTogether. This is really just a gift from us to you to help you figure out if you're ready to go down the pathway of upgrading into a more modernized version of advanced planning and scheduling in general. So that's this is a really great resource to have. We'll give that to you as an item after today's webinar. But what we're going to do now is shift into a little bit of a Q&A. And Colin, I hope you're ready. We've got a couple of questions that we can talk through. So we're going to do one of the other ones that have come in. Let's see. We've got okay, so let's say that somebody is ready to, let's see, can you please talk about the practical change management framework that you use during these consulting initiatives with your clients? I'm aware of ADKAR, but looking for the how.
Yeah. You know, one thing we've learned over time is that change management in APS projects, has to be extremely operational and practical. Not just theoretical, right? Frameworks like ADKAR are valuable because they give structure to the human side of the transformation. But in manufacturing environments, successful change management usually comes down to a few very tangible execution disciplines. One second.
Got it. Got it. Okay. What about when somebody does decide, well, let's see, APS implementation initiatives usually are bottom up, right? From engineers to higher management, or are they the other way around? Which do you typically see being the primary driver of a project?
Oh, interesting question. You know, I the way that we recommend approaching it, right, is engaging at a higher level to establish what are the target KPIs from a strategic business perspective that we're aiming to target, and what are our baselines,
Hmm.
and then pivoting to talking to the business, to the operations, understanding what is their manufacturing process in great detail, and what is their as-is scheduling process, and then based on the confluence of those KPIs as sort of a compass, right? And the input of their manufacturing process and their as-is scheduling process, consulting and prescribing the to-be scheduling process in a way that's conducive or fulfilling the vision of those strategic KPIs. So I think
Yeah.
it's sort of a dual approach in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll maybe talk to this from a different perspective. When because I really appreciate that question. They also ask, what's the difference when you see it coming from bottom up versus top down? I'll tell you when I work with customers that it is the scheduler, it's the boots on the ground that recognize the problem before it is the executives. One of the big jobs that you have as kind of the frontline infantry, if you will, is you've got to help communicate the vision of how this is going to impact the direction the business is going. I'll be honest, most of your executives just don't care about the tactical, like what you do to make a schedule work, whether it's Excel or an APS, is not really all that relevant to them. They care about steering the business. So the more that you can help them understand how transitioning into an APS will help the stability and the growth of the organization, the more you're likely to get a project like that off the ground because you're speaking the language of what they care about. So that's just a little advice from what I've seen from people that are trying to do a bottom-up approach is you've got to learn how to talk the executive language there, or at least help them see some of the problems from your perspective so they can figure out how to adjust that to their paradigm. Another question is, when somebody realizes that they want to do an implementation, what kind of trial period do you see the need for a client, or maybe a feeling that they have to roll out for an APS? Once they realize Excel is no longer manageable, how long of a trial period do they typically like build into their projects?
Are we thinking about this as like a testing sort of a period or
Yeah, like a test period, whether it's a pilot or a POC or something like that, some way to just to validate whether it works.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, from a deep dive evaluation perspective, Pilot, I think provides a really good lens there.
Mhm.
And what that would uh, unlock or allow for that team during our build process, we structure it in a series of sprints, and we have a playback at the end of each, and then we open up the model on an iterative basis for the team to step into the model and evaluate it. Um, that iteratively builds up into UAT, and then there's a UAT period where they're hands-on, they're driving, so that that gradual acclimation has a good runway there of
Yeah.
a number of weeks. So that generally be
Mhm.
a
Well,
recommendation.
let's shift into another one real quick. So we've got a couple minutes left. Do you apply the business focus approach that you mentioned right from the pre-project stage of things?
Uh, Absolutely, yes. In fact, yeah, I would say I think that's where it matters the most. Uh, One of the biggest reasons that APS projects can struggle is that organizations begin evaluating software before they're aligned on the business problem that they're trying to solve. So I think
Yeah,
it's critical that that happens up front.
yeah, yeah. I see that all the time, all the time. So we've got to follow up on one of the earlier questions around
Oh
top
yeah.
down, bottom up, where you talked about some of the disciplined execution. So they essentially are asking, what are the disciplined execution practices you're referring to? Maybe if you just want to clarify some of that.
Yeah, yeah. What I'm really referring to is the operational habits and governance mechanisms that keep the implementation grounded in the day-to-day reality instead of allowing it to become a purely technical project. Uh, in my mind, in successful APS programs, um, there are very usually very few kind of consistent practices in place. So it's really important to ensure that we have those operational habits and governance mechanisms.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, I think that was all of the questions for today, unless I'm missing one. But thank you all for the great questions. I appreciate that. I always love a good Q&A at the end. But with that, we are at time. So if there happens to be any other questions that we see pop in at the end of this, we'll get to them after the webinar and respond there. But I appreciate your time today and looking forward to continuing the conversation. Feel free to email us if you have any questions that you would like us to address or unpack. Have a great day.